All right, welcome back everyone for the last session of the day. I've just been reminded to remind you that all the previous sessions that have been recorded are already available to watch, and this one will also be recorded and available probably about an hour and a half after the day is over. I think our next set of speakers will nicely bring together a lot of the themes that have permeated the discussions during the day to help us all look forward and make a difference for the welfare of wild animals. First, we're going to be hearing from Peter Sandøe from the University of Copenhagen and Clare Palmer from Texas A&M. Floor is yours.
Oh, it's pitch dark in here. Is there no one in the room? What's happening? Oh, I can see a bit. At least I can see myself. But am I the only one in the room? Oh, there's Michelle. Nice to see you, Michelle. Hope things are okay down under. And Anne, also from down under in Sydney. Wow, there's Claire. But I have a feeling there's someone else in the room. What can that be? I have a funny smell. Something else seems to be happening. Wow. Oh, there's an elephant in the room. Wow. So we better get on with our talk, because the elephant in the room relates to the question, to what extent do we have an obligation to prevent or alleviate the suffering of wild animals? And as already indicated, with me I have Michelle Campbell-Ward from University of Sydney, and Quayne, also from University of Sydney, and Clare Palmer from Texas A&M. And we all gathered here to discuss this important issue. So the question now to ask is, which room, which elephant? Well, it all goes back to the previous World Wild Animal Welfare Conference held in 2021. I was present there and noticed that all the talks focused on anthropogenic effects on wild animal welfare. There was an apparent reluctance to discuss wild animal welfare issues occurring naturally, even when these questions were directly raised, as they actually were by myself on several occasions. So I was the irritating guy in the room that time. So the elephant concerns what to do about non-anthropogenic wild animal suffering, and that elephant is certainly in our Wild Animal Welfare Conference room, but not only there, as we should see, it's all over the place in the surrounding society. So the plan for our talk is that we will start by telling in which way sort of animal welfare science have managed to evade the issue. Then we'll get into a discussion of what may explain this evasive attitude, which is that there's actually a lot of fighting or disagreement between, on the one hand, academic conservation scientists, and on the other hand, all those who want to look after the welfare of wild animals. And maybe animal welfare science has tried to avoid getting into that trouble. Then, to guide our further thinking, we'll give some cases where the issue of wild animal welfare has been prominent. It's been about the Australian wildfires, where notoriously people try to save a number of charismatic animals. Sarcoptic mange, nasty disease. There are groups out there who try to help animals with that nasty itching disease. There's a whole issue about when people find juvenile wild animals that sort of are without a mother and take them in, imprint them, give them a happy life as a pet, but with some possible side effects. And then we end with a case of hedgehogs in Denmark. Hedgehogs, unlike some of the other animals, don't imprint well, so they will go back in nature, and there seems to be a good candidate for a case where you can do something for welfare without actually having negative effects on conservation. And then we will discuss whether we can define a possible middle position between, on the one hand, the view where only looks at conservation and the view that only looks at welfare. Is there some way of balancing the two? And we're going to come up with a suggestion and bring that out at the end of this talk. So let me start by saying a few words about the animal welfare science and the current situation where so far wild animal welfare in case of animals that are not affected by us has not really been an issue. So what is it about animal welfare science? Why does animal welfare science have problems with these things? Well, firstly, it's important to understand that where animal welfare science comes from. Originally dating back to the 1960s, where animal welfare science sort of was started as a discipline in the wake of the book by Ruth Harrison and the Bramble report. Their focus was only on farm animals. Quickly, animal welfare science also had a focus on suffering of laboratory animals. And more recently, you see welfare science going into other issues like companion animals and zoo animals. And when it comes to wild animals, there's also been some focus on human impacts. I mean, what we do to them in terms of hunting, pest control and regulation, and other anthropogenic effects, for example, when environment is changed, how, for example, big windmills can have an effect on the welfare of birds or bats. But so far, nothing or next to nothing on naturally occurring welfare problems faced by wild animals. So how comes that? Well, here we are going to suggest some sort of diagnosis of the problem, which is that probably animal welfare science is caught in the crossfire between two forces. On the one hand, we have beyond mainstream animal welfare science, there's been, I mean, outside academia, there's been a growing focus on welfare problems faced, or also partly within academia, a growing focus on welfare problems faced by wild animals, including non-anthropogenic suffering. I mean, going back even to the 70s, there's been wildlife rescue and rehabilitation. I mean, this effort to go in and rescue animals, despite whether or not they're threatened or not, just for the sake of their welfare. Recently, there have been philosophical approaches, so not from welfare science, but from philosophy. For example, Oscar Horta, who in his work has argued that, okay, we actually need to look after the welfare of wild animals for their own sake, and, for example, vaccinate wild animals against infectious diseases, even if there's no conservation purpose, but just for the sake of their welfare. And there have been the wild animal initiatives and other similar initiatives, for example, looking at contraception for wild animals. Contraception, this is in this case pictures of mouse, but it could also be contraception of deer. So to try to sort of improve the welfare of the animals, for example, when they're super abundant, by intervening. So outside academia, there have been these initiatives. And even in popular culture, I come from Denmark, so I have to show this little Lego box. There you can see, you can give your kids or your grandchildren, in my case, a box of Lego with a wildlife rescue off-roader. So even in the world of toys, we're out there to rescue wildlife. Wildlife needs our help. But I think the reason why many animal welfare scientists have been reluctant to go into this is that they see a tension between traditional conservation science and these initiatives, so they can risk being caught in crossfire. Traditional conservation science and conservation, from their perspective, only population, species, and systems matter. There's a preference for hands-off approaches to avoid affecting natural dynamics. So the general morale is hands-off. And animal welfare science may have sympathy with concerns about wild animal welfare, but may want to stay out of the crossfire with conservation science. But perhaps there's room for a middle way, and that's what we're going to address in this talk. But before we get there, we are going to look for some cases. So the cases may help us reflect a bit further on what's doable and possible in this area. Our first case concerns the situation with wildfires in Australia in the summer 2019 to 2020. There was an extraordinary magnitude of wildfires, and the feeling was that this was partly caused by us, largely caused by us due to climate change, and therefore that developed a profound community concern for and media attention directed to the welfare of the fire-affected animals. So lots of animals were taken out of the fire, were put to veterinary care, were kept in confinement and treated and brought back. So and that was seen by many people as a great thing. However, there were some issues here, because firstly, focus was more on welfare than conservation. Many of the animals helped, like the red kangaroo here, had no conservation benefit, were not endangered. The problem is also wildfires. There have always been wildfires in Australia. That's part of the normal environment. They may be sort of more abundant and bigger than usually, but still is a part of the nature. Should we intervene whenever there's a wildfire? It was also very costly, and you could discuss whether you could have spent money better for other welfare goals. And when you actually, at the end of the day, counted the number of animals that rescued and their rehabilitation success, that was pretty low. So maybe that's not the most effective way of using resources. A further thing was then some of the things that was done was about sort of, for example, introducing wildlife drinking station. That may help after the fire, help some of the surviving animals to get enough to drink. But of course it may also attract animals that are more dependent on water, and so maybe some of the invasive species may have a great day, and some of the pest animals. So there could be possible negative ecological effects too. The next case concerns a really nasty disease, and we know it's nasty because it's zoonotic. Something can affect us too. Sarcoptic mange. That's a naturally occurring disease among wildlife. You can see here deer, giraffe, wombat, and I think it's leopard. So widespread disease, really unpleasant. What to do about that? Well, traditionally, the view has been that you should look at it from an ecological population perspective, and if this disease does not threaten biodiversity, don't do anything. And the idea of treating individual animals has been widely criticized in literature, and mostly, in some cases, this idea has been hands-off, monitor. If the animals get through it, if the population in the long term is not affected, don't do anything. This is natural. However, it is seen across the world that some people react. These are wombats in Australia, where people actually go out and give antiparasitic drugs to help the animals with some effect, but of course also with some risks. So what to do about it? And here you have another case of foxes. I mean, if you come across a fox like this, should you just leave it? Should you kill it? Or should you treat it? And here there's actually a local fox whisperer who actually helped wild foxes like this to survive. So the issues here is the mange has a long non-anthropogenic history, so it's actually part of natural life. In most cases, it's not a conservation concern. Causes a very high level of suffering that can be alleviated by treatment. But alternative could be to euthanize animals. So now here we come into also the debate about what's the best way to help very sick wild animals. Is it to shoot, in this case, shoot the fox, or treat it? And if you treat it, then there could be potential side effects to treatment. I mean, you could get drug resistance among the animals, which means that you couldn't treat in the future, or you could ecotoxicity, so you can affect the environment in a bad way. The next case concerned the hand rearing of juvenile wild animals. I mean, abandoned young animals found in the wild and taken in and hand reared. And the problem about that is, of course, they may imprint and then end up in essentially being sort of dependent on living with humans. One case was a famous case of a magpie that was imprinted that way and ended up actually being confiscated because that's illegal in Australia, but that generated an enormous social media reaction, and at the end of the day a politician actually made an exception, caused a lot of resentment among conservation people, so actually this magpie is now allowed to go on living with its good dog friend, which is very unnatural for a magpie. The other case is from Denmark. That was a fox was brought into a man who, from a colleague, from a friend. It was sort of he had two fox pups that were brought in. The mother had been shot. He tried to rear them. One died, the other survived, and they actually seemed to build a bond and had a good life together. But it's illegal in Denmark to have foxes as on farms or anywhere else. So you're not allowed to have foxes in, as an animal in your home. At the end of the day, he was told by authorities to kill the fox. He tried to hide the fox, but at the end of the day, he couldn't bear it, so the fox was actually euthanized. So we Danes are a bit more tough than the Australians. Our politicians don't give in the way they do in Australia. On the other hand, there you see also a famous example. There was a squirrel called Tintin, which actually the owner was allowed to keep, so not very consistent even in Denmark. The problem with the case is that these animals often end up as human companions. In individual cases, for the animal, it may not matter. Could be a problem when they get sexually mature, but in some cases, well, they might have a good life as a pet. And this pet keeping, as we know from James Chappell and others, has a long history across many cultures. But there's a new risk if keeping wildlife as pets takes off via social media. And here there may be significant long-term problems, both from conservation and animal welfare perspectives. There's really good reasons to think twice about these things. The last case I'm going to bring up is a Danish case. In Denmark, hedgehogs largely live in private gardens. And often in the spring, people either find hedgehog pups or whatever they're called, young hedgehogs, abandoned by their mother, or their mother has died, or they find dehydrated, emaciated hedgehogs. And then a system has developed where animal protection organizations take them in, they feed them, look after them, and bring them back again. Unlike the magpie or the fox, they don't get tame. Hedgehogs, they don't care about humans, so you can just bring them out again to continue their life. So there doesn't seem to, in that way, to be a big issue about looking after conservation and petification. So rescued hedgehogs, in contrast to the other examples, don't seem to end up as pets. Seemingly there's a high rate of survival in contrast to the wildfire case. Plausibly reduces suffering and death for individuals, but on the other hand, there's very little effect on populations to concern conservationists, but either way, doesn't help population, but doesn't harm it either. How can these cases help our thinking? Well, different cases have very different implications, both for welfare and conservation. Some welfare interventions are ineffective or may help a few individuals, but risk a longer-term overall welfare. I mean, the case with the wildfires and the case of petification. Other welfare interventions could have worrying long-term ecological effects. I mean, all the three first cases, that could be certainly effects on wildlife. But some may bring the intended benefit without generating longer-term ecological worries. For example, the hedgehog case. So it seems as though a middle ground, though with some hard cases, may be possible. So what is a possible middle position? Well, we should be aware that there are two philosophical schools here. There are forms of environmental ethics where focus is primarily on protecting wildness, biodiversity, and ecological processes. And there are forms of animal ethics where focus is primarily on protecting the welfare and lives of animals. So you have these two different ways of thinking. Focus on environment, only environment, and biodiversity, and focus only on animals and animal welfare. And we think there's room for various middle positions. There's nothing incoherent about thinking that both animal welfare and ecological processes and biodiversity are worth protecting in their own right. But of course, when you do that, you need to prioritize. So all the four of us can agree that in cases where there are significant problems for ecological processes and biodiversity, then don't prioritize assisting wild animals. We actually think that biodiversity, nature protection is more important. Sorry. However, if wild animals can be effectively assisted with limited or no expected ecological costs, then helping may be desirable or should at least not be ruled out. So our conclusion is that so far animal welfare science has largely evaded discussions of naturally occurring welfare problems faced by wild animals. But the discussion is growing outside of mainstream science. Helping wild animals raises questions about effectiveness, cost, and conservation impacts. But we think in some cases there may be effective and low-cost ways of relieving suffering without compromising conservation values. And therefore there's room for a middle position that considers both animal welfare and ecological processes, biodiversity as important values. So, to conclude, helping wild animals in the context of naturally occurring suffering may not be an obligation. We don't quite agree on that, but we agree that at least it's ethically permitted and desirable in at least some cases. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Peter. That was a great introductory slide. We'll take questions later during the panel session, so please, you'll come up later when we have...
Maria, Peter's got 5 minutes for questions.
Okay,
here, so.
Sorry. All right then, Peter, you have 5 minutes for questions.
I think also maybe Claire and Michelle should come in these 5 minutes. I should just say I made a terrible mistake. That spotted animal is a leopard, not a cheetah. It's a cheetah, not a leopard, but I was cheated by the cheetah. So I thought it was leopard, but it is a cheetah.
All right. Yeah. So I have a couple of questions. I'll start with the audience. So first question, I think, is who makes the decision about helping or not helping?
Anyone you want to respond, Michelle or Claire?
Shall I grab that to start with? I think it's as demonstrated by the various case studies that Peter presented. I guess it's very context dependent, and we frequently find ourselves in situations where there's multiple people making conflicting decisions, which is why this conversation is so important. And you know, I think there's been lots of discussions in all the great talks today about, I guess, about some of these conflicts and the need for multidisciplinary discussions, because I think one group is unable to make a decision that is going to satisfy everybody, and we're going to end up with unintended consequences if we have a very narrow view of these things. So they're sort of my general thoughts. I'll pass over to Peter or Claire if they've got anything further to add.
You got something to add?
Yeah. So we have another question about, do you think then that compassionate conservation and welfare conservation could bring light to all of these situations? And this is being asked by Deborah Silvia Razzinati.
Well, I mean, may I start? I think compassionate conservation is about slightly different. That's mainly about when you sort of are going to do control, how you do it. So it's not so much about the naturally occurring suffering. But I think these movements have a point, but our view is actually that you also have to balance it against conservation values, and sometimes it may actually be an otherwise thing to do. So we're not so generally saying that welfare should always prevail. We think that there should be room for both things, but when prioritizing is needed, then sometimes, I mean, mostly then conservation is more important. That's actually where we end. Do you want to add something, Claire, Michelle, maybe Claire?
Yeah, I mean, compassionate conservation has, as Peter said, I think the main focus has been when you're doing conservation interventions, then you should, you know, be careful about how you deal with animal welfare and try and do the things that are going to be least harm and things like that. Whereas we're kind of interested in, well, what about just suffering that we just encounter? So I don't think compassionate conservation anyway yet has a view on that, and I suspect they also are kind of worried about what the implications are of going down that road. So haven't really commented on it yet. I think there's been one or two things in conservation biology, but hasn't really been developed.
Michelle, you had something to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think compassionate conservation and conservation welfare are useful movements that are attempting in some ways to address these issues. But I think where we're currently sitting and the ongoing questions is that alone they're not perhaps enough. So we're just keen to kind of open that discussion up and get other people's views on where the gaps lie. I think they've made headway into this space of that, finding that middle ground, but we seem to still have some gaps that we're struggling to negotiate.
I mean, we say we agree with these two movements in that this traditional conservation views, hands off, as long as these wild animals, leave them to suffer as much as they can, as long as there's no conservation problem. And we say, no, I mean, for goodness sake, if we've, without any cost to conservation or the minimal cost to conservation, can actually do something for welfare, why not do that? So this sort of pluralist view is our contribution to this. And in that way, we at least agree with these others, but not sharing their view, but sharing the opposition to the conservation only view.
And I think it's certainly my observation that even within, you know, picking one movement of compassionate conservation, there's a spectrum of ideas within that that can vary quite widely. And so there's still debate to be had even within one sort of subset of thinking.
Okay, I think, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, that we've run out of time for questions, but there's a lot more questions that are coming through, so maybe we'll save them for the panel Q&A, if that's okay with everyone. Great, thank you. Okay, so next we have Grace Carroll from Queen's University of Belfast.
Hi everyone, my name is Grace Carroll and I'm here to talk to you today about the science of behaviour change. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why we need to understand human behaviour in order to improve animal welfare, and a little bit about how we can get started if you want to look at human behaviour. So I have a bit of a mixed background. So I did my BSc in psychology, and then I went to do an MSc in animal behaviour and welfare, and then a PhD in pig welfare. I spent about 2 years at Hartbury University teaching on an animal behaviour and welfare course, worked on a short stint in industry working with broiler chickens, and then I began my position at Queen's University Belfast. And at the time I was becoming interested in trying to change farmer behaviour. So as I said, my research was mostly based on pig welfare, and I was just thinking about all the welfare problems that we have that still, we know exactly what causes them, we know how to address them, but nothing has changed. So tail biting, for example. So for those of you not familiar with the problem, in intensive pig farms, tail biting is a problem. So the pigs bite each other's tails, and it's largely due to a lack of ability to express normal behavior like exploration and rooting, which pigs are highly motivated to do. So in order to address this, farmers take off half the tail. And routine tail docking is actually banned in the UK and the European Union, but it's still widely practiced. And that's because other methods of addressing this welfare issue aren't practically viable. So if we look at this picture here, you can see the pigs with their tails docked. They're usually twice the length that they are in that picture. But you can see the slatted flooring system. And that makes management of the animals easier. It allows manure to pass through into the slurry system. If we try and put things like straw in there, which is the kind of gold standard in terms of enrichment for pigs, it can block the system. So it's a good example of knowing what needs to be done, but it doesn't happen because it's not practical for the people that are in charge of the animals on a day-to-day basis, which are the farmers. So it's really starting to, to make me think that we have all of these things are influencing human behavior, and they directly affect welfare. So humans are the ones that have the control over the animals, and therefore the likelihood is that if they don't change their behavior, then animal welfare won't change. So before working in the School of Psychology, I'd worked more with biologists, but because I was kind of going back into psychology, I started attending lunchtime seminars. And I realized that there's a whole discipline dedicated to human behavior change. So psychologists have already worked out what influences human behavior, what strategies tend to be successful in changing human behavior in certain contexts. And this is good because it means that we can avoid the common the kind of pitfalls that you might encounter when you're designing human behavior change interventions from scratch. So the mistakes have already been made, the lessons have already been learned. There are specific methods of changing human behavior that have been known to work based on past research. So we as animal welfare scientists can utilize that previous research to actually apply it to an animal welfare context. Previously, it was largely done with things like changing human behavior to stop people from smoking or to get them to lose weight. But the importance of human behavior in influencing animal welfare is becoming more and more recognized. So why not apply what psychologists have learned to an animal welfare context? So when it comes to wild animal welfare, again, I'm not an animal welfare expert when it comes to wild animal species, but things that come to mind for me will be things like the illegal wildlife trade, human-wildlife conflict, maybe negative effects of tourism, and things like poaching. So if we look at all of these issues, and I'm sure many more issues, we can see that it's really humans that are at the center of all of this. So it's humans that are trading the animals. It's humans that are buying the animals, that are creating the demand. Human-wildlife conflict, it's humans that are encroaching on wild animals' territories. Tourism, again, it's the humans that are attending the tours, that are facilitating the tours. Poaching, it's the humans that are doing the poaching. So a lot of welfare issues, if not all of them, are directly influenced by human behavior. So we can understand the welfare issue, we can understand the implications for animal welfare, but if we don't understand the humans, then there's no point in having that knowledge because it won't end up being used. So nothing will change until we stop focusing on just the animal behavior. We need to also focus on the human behavior. So why use methods from psychology? So when I looked at the animal welfare literature, I noticed that we're getting better now in the last 5 years or so, but we tend to be behind the times. So for example, a lot of animal welfare papers tend to focus on the theory of planned behavior. So the theory of planned behavior was quite popular a few decades ago in psychology, and it's the idea that attitudes predict intentions, which in turn predict behavior. And while this is useful and can predict behavior to a certain extent, it ignores external factors that might affect our decisions. If we think of, let's say me, for example, in January, I might have the intention of going to the gym, but a month later, it might not have actually happened. So there's what's known as the behavior intention gap. What I intend to do doesn't always translate into what I actually do. And if we think about farm animal welfare, for example, things like market forces, the government's regulations, changing consumer demands, all of these different things will play a role. So you can actually think for your own wild animal welfare issue, what external factors are influencing people's behavior. It might not just be things internal to them, their beliefs, their motivations, but also external things, the social environment, the physical environment. So both intrinsic and extrinsic determinants of behavior need to be considered. So psychologists and now animal welfare scientists as well are starting to move more towards overarching frameworks of human behavior change. So the theory of planned behavior is within that framework, but so is loads of other theories. And the behavior change wheel is a good place to look if you are interested in understanding human behavior and trying to change it. So it's an overarching framework that considers things that are internal to the person and external. And it's important to specify active ingredients of interventions. So the proposed mechanism of change, what actually worked. If you design an intervention, you might say an education intervention was created, but what was it that actually changed behavior? Was it the content of the education program, the fact that it was running in the first place? Were there any persuasion methods that were used to get people to change? So this guideline, the behavior change wheel and associated frameworks, help you to dig down into defining the problem, identifying things that would work, and then when you're trying to test an intervention, giving enough detail that it can be replicated, that we can actually tease out what part of the intervention worked or didn't work. So there's lots of guidelines available to help with this. I would also say as well, it's important to consult with someone that has experience in behaviour change interventions, like a health psychologist, for example, as well. So we can try and do these things ourselves, but it's always good to have a psychologist on board, or even have to have a health psychologist, for example, that you can consult with when you're starting to think of these things. But it will need to be a kind of multidisciplinary thing. So you will understand the welfare, you'll probably have a good understanding of the people involved in the system and the things that are influencing their behaviour. But then you need a psychologist as well, just to make sure things are designed properly or considered properly. So this is just the behaviour change wheel, just to get you familiar with it. And it's the one that I would use in addition to other frameworks as well. So you have within this behaviour change wheel, the innermost layer is the COM-B, which I'll talk about in a second. It's a nice, easy to understand method of understanding the behaviour. So we start off with understanding the behaviour, and then we've got different intervention functions and policy categories. So defining the behaviour and then exploring what types of interventions would be useful for any given barrier. So first of all, thinking about at the most basic level, whose behaviour do you want to change? Is it the consumers? Is it the poachers? What specific behaviour do you want to change? It's very hard to say you want to change several behaviours at once. It's always good to be able to say, I want to focus on this behaviour that you might have identified as being the most important. And what is the desired outcome? Do you want to see a reduction in the number of wild animals that are sold? Do you want to see a reduction in the number of wild animals that are killed in the process of capturing the species? And a distinction should be made between the outcome and the behaviour. So the behaviour, for example, might be you want to choose to target consumer behaviour. So you want them to stop purchasing illegally traded wildlife. Or you might focus on an outcome. So you might, I don't care how you get to it, but I want to see a decrease in the number of animals trafficked and traded illegally. So sometimes there's less focus on a given behaviour and just focusing on the outcome. And sometimes you want to focus on a specific behaviour. So what you focus on will depend on what is most viable in a given context. So the behaviour change wheel, the centre layer, the COM-B. So COM stands for capability, opportunity, motivation. Again, this is the best place to start and the kind of simplest place to start when you're starting to think about what barriers are there to seeing the behaviour or the outcome that I want to see. So capability, opportunity, motivation is closely related to means, motive, opportunity in a murder case. If we can explain those three different things, we can understand why a person murdered someone, for example. So it's the same concept. Capability, so the person or the people concerned must have the physical strength, for example, the psychological capability, so the knowledge, the skills, the stamina needed to perform a behaviour. They need to have opportunity for the behaviour to occur. So is there a conducive physical environment or social environment? Is it physically accessible? Is it affordable? Is it socially acceptable? Do people have time to do the behaviour? And then we have motivation. So for example, if you're highly motivated to do something, you're more likely to do it. If you're highly motivated to do a kind of competing behaviour, you're less likely to display the potentially desired behaviour. So these components interact with each other. So you can see the arrows here, they're basically showing that, for example, if you increase opportunity or capability, you could also increase motivation by doing that as a byproduct. So all of these different things interact with each other to influence behaviour. So you can use this COM-B model in a variety of ways. So you could design an interview schedule that has these as your kind of broad categories. So do you know, let's say for capability, psychological capability, do you know how to purchase a reptile that has come from a reputable source? Do you know what the reputable sources are? Do you care about where you get your animal from? If the person doesn't care, then they're less likely to to look into, where they're sourcing their animal from. And do they have the physical opportunity to perform desired behaviour? So maybe irreputable sales are the only ones that are available to somebody. So you can use these frameworks in creating interview schedules, focus group schedules, questionnaires. You could do a review of the literature and divide it into these different things and understand the barriers and the facilitators of the behaviour or the outcome that you want to see. So it's a nice, easy to understand thing, and it can be used for individual people, it can be used for groups or large populations. So once you've identified, sometimes it might be all three. There might be issues of capability, opportunity, and motivation, or one might be more prominent than another. Then you've got your intervention functions. So that's the second layer of the wheel, the red. So these are broad categories of means by which an intervention can change behaviour. So how will you enable implementation? Will you offer a service? Will you run a marketing campaign? Will new legislation be created? And this layer is based on a systematic review of frameworks of behaviour change. So 19 frameworks were identified, and when you break those down, there's basically 9 core intervention functions and 7 policy categories. So we can see education, persuasion, incentivization, coercion, which we would try and avoid unless absolutely necessary. So you can see there's a list of intervention functions, and they relate back to the COM-B. So for example, capability can be addressed by education. Motivation, you might need to use persuasion. So they all link, there's a link between the barriers and then what intervention functions might actually work. And then the policy categories, so actions that can be taken by responsible authorities to enable implementation. So would it be a communication or a marketing campaign? Would you create guidelines, fiscal measures, regulations, legislation, service provision, environmental planning, for example? So it relates to higher level policy changes that might be needed to support the implementation of a behaviour change technique. And just to show you how they fit into each other here, so these are pages taken from Mickey et al. 2014 book, which I would highly recommend reading. Very easy to follow. It's just basically a guideline on how to do behaviour change interventions. And you can get it as an ebook, or you can buy it. It's not too expensive. But these are from various pages in the book. So I might have interviewed pig farmers, let's say, and I might have identified reflective motivation as a barrier. So belief about capabilities. So farmers often think that they can't control tail biting. It occurs in outbreaks and they have no control over it. Therefore, there's no point in trying to manage it. I might also interview them and find that belief about consequences is relevant. So, for example, they might not believe that tail biting has any effect on productivity. Therefore, it's not really one of the most important issues. So I might have decided, okay, I'm going to focus on an intervention that focuses on motivation, reflective motivation. So if you go to reflective motivation, then on another page, it gives you a map, and all the dark colored squares are the filled in squares. Sometimes it's hard to read properly, but I want to address reflective motivation, and it tells me that intervention functions, education, persuasion, incentivization, and coercion are most appropriate if you want to address motivation. So I might decide I want to use persuasion to address the motivations of pig farmers in terms of tail biting. So I'm going to use persuasion. Then on another page, persuasion is linked to the policy categories. So if I want to use persuasion, there are several methods I can use here. But one here is service provision. So I'm not the government, I can't change the legislation, but I could provide a service and see if that reduces tail lesion prevalence. So I could, it's starting to set up, this is the barrier and this is an intervention type that would be suitable. There's then what's called the behaviour change technique taxonomy. I won't go into it in too much detail, but it can be downloaded as an app if you type in BCT taxonomy into Google Play or the iPhone store. And it basically links these different intervention functions, so education, persuasion, etc., to behaviour change techniques, so the active ingredients of an intervention. So if I go onto the app and I go to persuasion, I can see that there's a few different techniques that are known based on previous research to work. So I might decide that I'm going to provide feedback on outcomes of the behaviour. So I can provide tail lesion prevalence to farmers to see if that motivates them to change. I might provide information on the percentage of carcass weight that's decreased as a result of tail lesions to show them that it actually does have implications for how productive they are. So you can use this as a framework to identify the most useful interventions to change behaviour of the individuals that you are interested in changing. There are also some handy tips and kind of acronyms that can be used to evaluate any intervention that you design. So there's what's called the APPEASE criteria, and this stands for affordability, practicability, effectiveness and cost effectiveness, acceptability, side effects, safety and equity. So if you design an intervention, you can actually decide to write a few comments on each of these criteria. Is it going to be affordable? Is it practical? You know, going back to the tail biting one, if I suggest the intervention is going to be that the farmers have to change their housing, that's not going to be realistic because it's not practical. The side effect would, or the cost effectiveness will be low. So you can rate these from 1 to 5, or you can do an assessment and decide in your own way, is the intervention that I've created, is it realistic based on these criteria? So it's just another useful way of evaluating your interventions that you do design. Again, then reporting your intervention based on the mistakes that were made in previous years and previous literature. You should describe the mode of delivery, the content, so what was delivered, provider, who delivered it, the setting, where it was delivered, recipient, to whom was it delivered, the intensity, over how many contacts was it delivered, duration, over what period of time, and then fidelity, so the extent to which it was delivered as intended. So the more detailed you can be, and the more you can clearly specify the active ingredients, so the things that are actually changing behaviour in your intervention, the more successful it's going to be. So use and practice so far. So I'm using this to look at barriers and facilitators in providing suitable housing for companion animal, so rabbits and small rodents in the UK. That's in collaboration with Hartpury University and Blue Cross. There's the One Well Pig project. So it's looking at barriers and facilitators in uptaking of alternative higher welfare pig farming systems in Ireland. So what are the barriers? Then we can decide how to address those barriers. And I'm also working on Pigtail project. So this is looking on barriers and facilitators of adherence to tail docking legislation. So this is how I'm using these at the minute, deciding on what are the barriers and then using this framework to even recommend ways that we can target behaviour to get the desired outcome. There's some further resources there that I can send everyone after the meeting. So thanks very much for listening. It's a whistle-stop tour. It's just really to make you aware of these different frameworks and why we need to look at human behaviour. So thank you very much, and I'll take any questions that you have now.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you very much. Thanks. I'm not sure if any of my wild animal biology students are listening, but we tell them all the time they all want wildlife careers, and we always say, like, you're gonna have to be working with humans a lot of the time. So hopefully they were taking notes during your presentation. While questions come through from the audience, I have a question. You had talked about one of the techniques for behavioral change, I think was if I can pronounce this right, incentivization, like incentivizing people for behavioral change. And that immediately made me think about cases where, say, for example, farmers are paid to avoid retaliation for killing predators like wolves or lynx when they predate on their sheep or what have you. I was wondering if you had, and those are known to sometimes backfire as well in terms of misuse of the schemes. Do you have any other examples of ways of incentivizing people to adopt or to change their behavior that is not just monetary?
Yeah, so I think it's hard because the most obvious answer is to give people money, but then that means that they're not really internally motivated. It's more an external reward Yeah, I don't really have an answer for that at the minute. You know, from working with pig farmers, for example, a lot of them just say, well, it needs to make financial sense for us to do what the government wants us to do or whatever. There are things like self-incentives, but I don't think they'd be applicable to farmers. So in psychology, you know, giving yourself a reward for like losing weight and things like that. So I don't think there's any easy answer that I've come across when it comes to my population, which would be farmers, in terms of incentivization. That seems to be the main focus, because what I've learned working with the pig farmers is they're under a lot of financial pressure. So I think that's the most obvious thing, and I think any other incentive would have to be quite strong. Yeah, but there are other ways of doing things as well. So, you know, the good thing about this framework is persuasion, for example. You might not need to actually give them any financial reward. You might just show them, well, you're losing money as it is, so you can change your behavior that way. So, but yeah, in terms of incentives, I'm still yet to solve that one.
So Stephen, we have a question from him, that he's suggesting as well that perhaps public recognition of good practice might be an incentive. I don't know if you've come across any examples of
I
that.
haven't come across any examples, but I have interviewed farmers, and one of the themes that came across was feeling that lack of recognition. I think, yeah, there are a lot of pressure to do what has to be done to follow the legislation more than any other group, really. So I think recognition would help. And even things like, you know, maybe benchmarking and telling them, right, you're in the top 10%, like having that recognition within the industry itself could help. But yeah, a lot of the behaviour change work is kind of in its infancy. So a lot of the projects I'm working on, we're still at stage one, which is what are the barriers? And the thing about behaviour change interventions, it's a long road. So we're still, because we're only kind of using these frameworks over the last few years, the amount of actual interventions that are coming out of it are kind of sparse. But I suppose if people want information, we could look more, you know, look more towards the psychology literature, where these frameworks have been used for a much longer time.
Okay, thank you. And one question coming through, where does behavior change sit relative to systems change?
Could clarify maybe what system change is referred to?
I think, well, maybe, well, Stephen ties, but I think like more like systemic changes, not just specific to human behavior change. So like,
Yeah, maybe, yeah. I don't really know how to answer that, but if you can elaborate.
I'll stick with another question that is like from Bonnie Flint saying, this method seems great for changing specific behaviors of individuals. How does this mesh with trying to change cultural attitudes at a larger level?
Yeah, so I think, you know, these frameworks have been used at population level as well, but what's appropriate to change at cultural level would be different than individual level. I suppose things that would come to mind would be things like the smoking ban. Well, it came in Ireland in 2004, I think, and there was a big culture that it's totally normal to smoke inside a pub, and how can you change that? But there was a mass change through, you know, public awareness campaigns, so you can target large audiences, but it is very hard to change culture. That's one of the big challenges, and sometimes things just happen by themselves, like, you know, the times change and it's hard to predict. But yeah, that's a difficult one. Sometimes it won't be possible, especially when it comes to cultures that are quite embedded. I think probably a lot of it would be education, but from a source that the individuals trust. So it's finding that kind of credible source of information, I think, can be important as well.
All right, thank you very much, Grace. We'll save any other questions for the panel later on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, our next speaker is Alan Rutberg from Tufts University.
Thank you for joining me. I'm Alan Rutberg. I am a PhD biologist and currently the director of the Center for Animals and Public Policy at the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine at Tufts University. I fell into the world of wildlife contraception by accident in the mid-1980s while I was doing unrelated behavior research at the free-roaming horses at Assateague Island National Seashore in Maryland. At Assateague, the horses had already had a significant impact on the island's flora and fauna, and the National Park Service brought horse contraception researchers John Turner and J. Kirkpatrick to the island in the hopes that they could stop the growth of these free-roaming horse populations. In 1991, I joined the Humane Society of the United States and Jay and John's research team. So I've been participating in the field applications of wildlife contraception for more than 30 years. Wildlife contraception is no longer hypothetical. It is happening now. It is being used to manage a number of populations of free-roaming wildlife and is being seriously considered for others as contraceptive techniques are improved. The Assateague horses were the first, with the National Park Service establishing the use of the PZP vaccine as a management tool in 1994, and using PZP to stabilize and then reduce free-roaming horse populations to hit their population targets, now in the range of 80 to 100 horses. In South Africa, PZP is being used to reduce the population growth rates of elephants in more than 43 privately owned reserves. In white-tailed deer, which are very abundant on the east coast of the United States, our research group has reduced suburban deer populations no fewer than 4 times, using intensive applications of PZP vaccines. The graph described 2 of these population reductions, about 50% in 5 years. One at Fripp Island, a resort and retirement community in South Carolina, and the other in Hastings-on-Hudson, a dense suburb about 10 miles north of New York City. Really, most of my own contraception research has been focused on suburban deer and free-roaming horses. From the policy perspective and with respect to how they are valued and viewed by the public, the 2 species are pretty different. But both species are highly controversial, and I've had to think a lot about what applications are both practical and consistent with my own values. I've often had to defend my thinking and my beliefs in public and professional forums, as well as wrestle with my own competing values. So, what is good for free-roaming animals and for the biological communities in which they live? At this point, a lot of us are struggling with how to apply animal welfare concepts to wild animals. We're saddled with the problem that concepts of animal welfare have arisen largely in context of animal use, and in practice are determined at least as much by how we use them as by the nature of the animals themselves. Mostly animal welfare concepts focus on comfort. But what do you do with animals that are serving their own ends and not ours? Given the choices available to wild animals, they do not always seek comfort. This is most obvious in behaviors that have to do with reproduction, aggressive competition for mates, time and energy expenditures spent on raising young, and so forth. Coming at this as a biologist, I feel that wild animals are our equals and partners, and that fundamentally we owe them the freedom to pursue their own interests. Where I've landed for now is that the best measure of wildlife welfare is autonomy, the ability to make choices. Wild animals have many opportunities for choice, where and how to spend their time, what to eat, who to associate with, and how to interact with them, who to fight, who to groom, and so forth. A nice corollary of this view is that richer environments provide individuals with more choices, an idea that bridges some of the gaps between welfare values and environmental values. It is also true that animals that are starving, sick, and otherwise suffering, the standard measures of bad welfare, also suffer a reduction of choice, as their behavioral options must focus narrowly on easing their suffering. In taking the choice view one step further, killing an animal eliminates all its opportunities for choice forever, and in social species may have repercussions for the survivors. Returning to our discussion of fertility control, inevitably, fertility control reduces choices related to reproduction, including especially the behaviors related to raising young by the parents and by other group members. Beyond that, the impacts on choice will depend on the method of fertility control chosen. These additional impacts can include risks of physical injury or death, and elimination of sexual behavior or competition for mates. The agent may be permanent or it may be reversible. These effects need to be studied for each fertility control agent. There's a wide variety of wildlife fertility control techniques out there. For many good reasons, the use of hormonal agents in wildlife is now largely limited to captive animals, which I'm not going to talk about today. Surgical sterilization techniques, ranging from vasectomies or castrations in males to tubal ligations or spays in females, carry at least some surgical risks and are all permanent, with behavioral impacts varying with the technique. Because I believe in minimizing impacts of contraceptives in wildlife, my own research has focused on injectable contraceptives, especially PZP. From a welfare viewpoint, I like immunocontraceptives because they can be DART delivered and therefore don't require capture and handling, and they can be reversible. In our experience so far, PZP has shown itself to be behaviorally benign with no obvious disruption of social structure, activity, budget, or habitat use. But again, of course, research into the impacts of all these techniques should continue. We also should not ignore the potential positive effects of fertility control on the choices open to wild animals. As noted, the less intrusive fertility control techniques leave intact much of the natural lives of wild animals, with the usual assortment of free behavioral choices. More, cutting the metabolic and behavioral costs of reproduction can allow more diet selectivity and flexibility in time budget and habitat use. Anecdotally, at our Fripp Island site, prior to PZP application and population reduction, deer were out and visible foraging all day long, which is not typical. Aside from the improved body condition we saw afterwards, the island's resident deer returned to a much more typical deer schedule of foraging in the morning and the evening, and remaining largely out of sight during daylight hours. These positive effects may be amplified both for the animals themselves and for the larger biological community if population reduction of the target species reduces its environmental impacts, potentially enriching diversity of plants, animals, and habitat structure. A more diverse habitat can yield more choices for all its inhabitants, including the target species. In practice, the welfare impacts of contraception have to be compared to the impacts of other management approaches. These approaches are almost always more invasive and more disruptive of animal lives than benign fertility control methods. In free-roaming horses in the US, even in the most hopeful case, the horses are removed from their homes and their families and end up adopted into an alien environment, surrounded by equine and human strangers, where everything about their lives is controlled by their adopters. Other alternatives are worse. Culling still seems to be a default alternative for wildlife. Aside from the intensive short-term suffering that may result from culling efforts, killing ends choice and autonomy. With few exceptions, we do know that animals try to avoid death. The other alternative is taking no population management action at all. From a wild animal autonomy perspective, that will usually be best. However, there are some circumstances when not intervening may result in profound suffering and death, notably when dense wildlife populations degrade the environment and impoverish the whole biological community. The other circumstance, which I've frequently encountered, are when the use of wild animal contraception can forestall more damaging interventions, such as displacement or culling. Under those circumstances, one hopes in the long run that contraception could also enhance public appreciation of wildlife and promote more neighborly attitudes. In any circumstances, if fertility management is to be applied to wild animals, managers should always employ the least invasive.
Thank you, Alan. Now we don't have the questions until after when we're all in the panel. So can I please remind the audience to type questions in the question or the chat area so that we can post those to the panel later. Thank you. Next, we have Stefano Canessa from the University of Bern.
Hello everybody, and thank you for your interest in our talk on integrating animal welfare in rational decision making for species conservation. In our line of work, together with John Ewen from the Zoological Society of London, Lisa Moser from the University of Bern, who will speak later, we try to assist conservation decisions, particularly those related to recovering and protecting endangered species. And these conservation decisions can often be difficult because our objectives might be unclear. Sometimes our options are quite limited and it's hard to choose. Very often we have uncertainty because of our limited knowledge of a system, or because the system itself is variable, is stochastic, it's unpredictable. And very often also because we have competing objectives. So we want to achieve something, but we also need to take into account another objective. For example, we want to be very effective in recovering species, but we only have a certain limited budget available. Sometimes we want to implement efficient actions, but we need and want to take into account animal welfare. This is what we're interested in right now. And so to make these difficult decisions, to help us facing these difficulties, we can use a set of principles and tools for rational decision making that have been developed over the last 7 decades and are commonly applied in economics, in engineering, in planning, for example, for healthcare, and increasingly in conservation. And the idea of these principles and tools is to reduce the risk of biases and irrational behavior that can be deliberate or not, and help us face in particular decisions under uncertainty and competing objectives. And we are finding it especially suitable for dealing with complex decisions, including increasingly those concerning animal welfare. And so we'll describe a little bit how we're trying to go about this. There are 2 principles underlying this idea of rational decision making. And the first is that we recognize that decisions have a subjective component, so something that we want to achieve, the aim that reflects our preferences and values. And they also have an objective component of facts and data and information that we want to use to make the decision that best achieves our subjective desires and preferences. Okay? And so, for example, in the case study that Lisa will describe better later, we need to control invasive turtles. We have different methods that we can use, such as trapping, shooting with a gun, using trained dogs to find and remove nests. And these have different effectiveness, they have different costs, and they also have different implications for animal welfare. And we can use, for example, something like multi-criteria decision analysis to compare information that we have about different methods and then judge how they achieve and respect our own subjective preferences and attitudes towards cost, towards removal of invasive species, towards their welfare, and so on. And the second underlying principle is that we need to be explicit about what we know and what we don't know, about this uncertainty. Because we need to make a decision by comparing predicted futures. How will the system be if I choose a certain method against a certain other method? And often this is really hard to know because we haven't applied these actions yet. And so we don't know, for example, the welfare implications of trapping and transporting and stocking turtles in a certain way. We don't know the cost and effectiveness and even the welfare implications of using a dog for finding nests and destroying the eggs. And so by being explicit about what we know and what we don't know, we can also set ourselves up well for learning in the future and improving our decisions later on. And sometimes, well, very often we try to do this to estimate this uncertainty using data, using empirical information, but this is not always possible, especially when we're talking about the future, and so we do have to rely on expert opinion. And the advantage of is that in decision analysis there are many good methods for eliciting expert opinion that accounts for possible biases and uncertainty, and we're trying to do this in animal welfare applications as well. And so after this preamble, I will let Lisa tell a bit about the invasive turtle problem, and we'll see how we are trying to use decision analytic tools to solve our decisions.
I'll now introduce a case study on how to assess and integrate animal welfare into multi-criteria decision making. Our study species is the pond slider, Trachemis crypta, a terrapin species native to the United States that has been spread all over the world through pet trade. Nowadays, it's unfortunately also one of the most invasive species worldwide, with being included in the IUCN list of the world's top 100 most invasive species. In Europe in particular, interactions with the native and protected European pond turtle, Emis orbicularis, are of concern. The Life Urca Pro Emis project, but also other projects, aim to improve the status of the European pond turtles and thus manage the invasive sliders using different methods such as direct suppression in the field via shooting or trapping with different subsequent actions. Here we're going to focus on the management by trapping, followed by captivity. When deciding between different methods, management practitioners often balance between effectiveness and cost of different methods. However, there is more to be considered, such as animal welfare. In our study, there are going to be 3 phases: the trapping, transport, and captivity. Trachemis are first trapped with either basking traps, here on the left top, or fight traps on the left bottom. The trapping is followed by a transport that the sliders spend in boxes, and finally they stay in captive centers for the rest of their lives. For each of those phases, we assess animal welfare. To do so, we use the structure of the 5 domains of animal welfare. The first 4 domains describe what the turtles experience from their environment, as well as any physical or behavioral constraints. The 5th domain is then the actual well-being of the animal, as it describes how they feel, like whether they're feeling unwell, suffering, or whether they're happy, and so on. The first 4 domains can be assessed empirically via measurements and observations in the field. We collect data on the first 4 domains for each phase, for the trapping, transport, and captivity. However, there is always uncertainty about how the different things measured actually impact the well-being of the turtles. As for example, just because there is no food available for a certain time, it doesn't mean that the animal is suffering because it doesn't need any food during that time. Therefore, we conduct an expert elicitation to assess the mental components, the 5th domain, like the actual well-being of the animals. We summarize the data from the field to create different scenarios that can, for example, range from the worst to the best case observed, or may even include worse or better scenarios than observed in the field. We're then reaching out to experts such as practitioners or veterinarians, and they're asked to score the impact of the scenarios on the well-being of the animals by choosing between 5 different levels of impact. They can express their own uncertainty or certainty by attributing percentages of certainty to each level of impact. This should therefore always add up to 100%. After the expert elicitation, expert estimates can be aggregated with different methods. Some methods, for example, allow us to attribute more weight to experts that are more certain about their answer than to to those that indicated a lower certainty to an answer. The analysis results in probabilities of each level of impact for each scenario, which is, in fact, a quantification of the risk of animal welfare being deprived. We now have attributed sort of a value to the animal well-being to each scenario and to each management method that allows us to use the assessment as an input in multi-criteria decision analysis models to also consider animal well-being besides costs and effectiveness when balancing between different management methods.
So, to briefly conclude, we're using tools from rational decision-making, structured decision-making, decision analysis to address our decisions, conservation decisions that involve welfare. And these tools and principles require us to separate values, subjective preferences, and science, information and data, to address both uncertainty and competing objectives in a transparent way. And so in this context, we are treating welfare alongside other more traditional conservation objectives. There are some challenges in doing this. First of all, we are finding it difficult to quantify exactly We're not even sure that a complete perfect quantification is at all necessary, but we are quite confident that we're always going to need some level of expert opinion, expert judgment, and so we do use expert elucidation quite a bit. And we try to use evidence and empirical data as much as possible, but we need to recognize the uncertainty inherent in many attempts to classify welfare impacts of different management strategies. And so with this, I thank you on behalf of all for your attention, and I look forward to a discussion, and feedback and impressions are very welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa and Stefano. We'll have time for questions later during the panel. Next and last, but certainly not least, I'm delighted to introduce Alice Bacon from the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland.
Sorry, but Alice's talk hasn't uploaded, so I'm going to try doing something else. 2 seconds. I thought I'd checked everything. Bear with me, I'm just going to try and play the video from my computer. And it's not there. Downloads.
My name is Alice Bacon, and I am one of the veterinary surgeons working for the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, and I work on the Saving Wildcats project, reintroducing wildcats to the Scottish Highlands. I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about the welfare of Scottish wildcats and how we have been mitigating post-race conflict through stakeholder engagement. So first of all, just a brief introduction to the wildcats. So Felis sylvestris, the European wildcat, is a small cat species which was historically widely distributed through Central and Western mainland Europe and the British Isles. There was a dramatic population decline in the UK through the 19th and 20th centuries, with only a remnant population left in the Scottish Highlands by the end of the 20th century. And decades of conservation work in the 20th century led to an International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, review of the species conservation status in Scotland in 2019. And this review concluded that the species is functionally extinct in Scotland and in the whole of the UK. So what has caused the extinction of wildcats in the UK? So widespread predator control was practiced throughout the United Kingdom in the 19th and 20th centuries. And this was to support sport shooting of ground nesting game birds, so typically pheasant and grouse species. Wildcats were only legally protected in 1988, so their killing was legal until this date. Since legal protection in 1988, there has still been some killing, either accidental non-target or illegal intentional persecution. And the reduction in population size of wildcats because of these predator control activities made wildcats more vulnerable to inbreeding with domestic cats, leading to progressive hybridization and genetic extinction by the end of the 21st century. So persecution and hybridization are examples of direct conflict with human activities, and activities where human behaviour change is key to mitigating these risks to wildcats and maintaining their welfare. So the 2019 IUCN review concluded that the only viable option for restoration of a wildcat population in the UK was through conservation breeding for reintroduction and releasing captive bred cats into the wild. So welfare in captivity receives a lot of attention in the management of zoo animals and in animals bred for conservation translocations, but often less consideration is given to post-release welfare. So the welfare of these animals used for reintroductions after they've been released into the wild. So today I'd like to focus on this, specifically on the risk to wildcats from ongoing predator control activities in the release sites, and these activities which may result in either accidental or intentional killing of cats. So we believe that we have a responsibility to mitigate risks to the wildcats post-release to protect their individual welfare. And historically, conservation translocations have focused on population level measures of success. So have we achieved a sustainable population, or have we achieved population growth? But we believe that the welfare of individual animals must also be considered, and that risk must be mitigated to all individuals where possible. So key to mitigating the risks to wildcats from predator control is starting to work with the landowners who manage the land where the predator control activities are taking place. So how did we begin this working relationship? So we wanted to try and build working, trusting relationships and to move away from the conflict and the concept of them and us, which has been so common in the conservation world in Scotland. But initially we needed to define our goal. So our goal is to establish a sustainable population of wildcats. We then needed to bring the right people into the conversation. So the people who are practicing predator control, which is proving a threat to wildcats. And we want to provide a space where both sides could be heard and listened to, and to help us understand each other's perspectives. And we felt that it's essential to validate people's feelings and concerns, and to ensure that they are genuinely respected if we want to try and build a trusting relationship. So we then endeavoured to incorporate people into the decision-making process, and not just listen to their opinions, but actually for them to have an active role in making decisions, and that not to be led from one side only. And we believe that change will not happen by dictating to people, and that rather we need to build open, trusting relationships if we really want to create lasting change. So we identified all the landowners around the proposed wildcat release site, and that site is pictured on the right in this picture. So it's an area around the Cairngorms National Park in the Scottish Highlands. And we organised initially just relaxed face-to-face informal blethers with people, with the intention of starting to build a picture of what is the level of risk to release wildcats. So understanding the predator control activities that people were undertaking, and to understand how gamekeepers felt about the proposed releases, and what their opinions were. And we needed to find common ground as a foundation for building a relationship, and to try and break down the traditional barriers and antagonistic interactions between conservationists and gamekeepers. And we drew inspiration from Dr. Brian McQuinn, who talks about the moral imagination, and that there is another way of doing things often, and that things which may seem impossible may actually be possible. And to believe in this really allows you to think outside the box. There has been an assumption in the conservation world that collaboration with gamekeepers is not possible, and there are many examples when it hasn't been achieved, but we believe that it was possible to build these collaborative relationships. And initially we had positive engagement with 24 estates around our proposed release site. So following these initial conversations, we've run 2 facilitated workshops. One was before the first releases in March 2023, and one was a year on in this year, March 2024. And the reason for facilitation is to try to remove the majority of the bias from the conversations. So conservationists shouldn't be leading the process because we can't truly be neutral, and facilitation takes away the bias and provides a level playing field. And often in other examples of conservation projects, this has been led by conservationists or by conservation NGOs. In these workshops, we discussed a variety of topics which everyone was encouraged to contribute to. And then through the process of those conversations, key concerns became clear. And we subsequently used these concerns as the focal points for our applied work, attempting to address these concerns and work towards a collaborative approach. So the first example of a concern was around the identification of wildcats. And for those of you who don't know Felis sylvestris, wildcats and domestic cats can look very similar. And lethal control of domestic feral cats is legal and is a legitimate activity of gamekeepers, but being able to identify between a feral cat and a wildcat is essential. So over 10 years ago, guidance was developed on how to distinguish between these species, and we had assumed that the guidance was sufficient. But through our conversations, it became apparent that the guidance was inadequate and that it was easy to wrongly interpret, leaving those practicing predator control without clear direction. So in collaboration with a group of gamekeepers, we've since developed new guidance, which is a simplified version of the original guidance, to try to minimize the risk of wrongly identifying a wildcat as a feral cat, resulting in it being killed. So wildcats were also released with GPS telemetry collars, and we developed a common strategy of how and when gamekeepers and landowners wanted to be informed of cats' location. And this includes WhatsApp messages sharing publicly unavailable data about the cat's locations, enabling those practicing predator control to be aware of the wildcat's presence. Sharing this data was initially controversial and has been an act of trust, but has been key in establishing collaborative working relationships, and we believe has been really essential to the high survival rate of our cats post-release so far. So we now have a very positive collaborative working relationship with many of the states within our wildcat release area. And 2 or 3 years ago, this would have been unthinkable. The relationship between gamekeepers and conservationists in this area was very poor. So without this engagement and communication and trust, we would still be in a situation of conflict and persecution, and the wildcat's welfare post-release would still be significantly compromised. This is perhaps an unusual example of how to maintain welfare in wild animals, but I hope it's been of interest, and I'm happy to answer any questions during the discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Alice, as well. I think it's a beautiful example, and yeah, brings it all things that we've been discussing together. And I think, at least to me personally, gives me hope, and it's inspirational as well. Can I please ask all the other speakers in this last session to turn on their cameras so that we can start the panel session or discussion Q&A? Great. Thank you all very much. There's a bunch of questions coming through, and please, for the audience, you can keep sending them. There's questions that are quite general and quite specific, so I'm going to try and mix them up to the best of my ability. Okay, I'm going to start with one of the more general ones. I think this came through with Peter and Claire and Michelle, like the first talk, but I think anybody can take it as well. Okay, so is Carly first I should say I agree with Samantha Oaks' saying, and I agree that your introductory slide was one of the greatest introductions to a talk ever, so thank you for that. The question is, in an environment that is so altered by anthropogenic causes, whether they are tangible causes like road strikes or intangible like less food availability because of climate change, what is the line of naturally occurring suffering and anthropogenic suffering, and how does that line influence whether or not we intervene? Easy question to get us started. Who wants to go? Nobody wants to take it.
Okay,
I'll start. I'm happy to start.
Then I'll have a quick go. I mean, the simple answer is there is no clear line. But of course, that doesn't mean that a line is not drawn by authorities. We will always be in sort of contexts where these lines are being drawn. We have to navigate a landscape where conservationists keep on upholding that line, because otherwise they will lose their grip. But I think the short answer is there's no clear line, and with no clear line, we really need to sort of understand that the whole debate was about where to draw the line. It's not a scientific debate, it's an ethical debate. And so in a way, it's the normative ethical questions going all the way through down to the bottom of this issue. And I really enjoyed, for example, Alan's talk about sort of discussing about exactly what is sort of the line of these things. So admitting that would allow for a much more honest conversation, and maybe also a way where we can get away of this alienation of on the one hand conservationists, on the other hand people with a different background, but just admit, well, there's no clear line and this is something to be negotiated.
Anyone
Just
else?
to add to that, I was going to make a comment about prioritisation, because I think we've heard a theme today that yes, you know, there is anthropogenic change occurring everywhere, even perhaps in seemingly untouched places. And I guess the question for everybody in terms of our obligation to intervene, perhaps, or to protect animals from welfare harms is if there's a problem that is clearly directly anthropogenic, does that change our prioritisation? And if there's something that is perhaps less directly anthropogenic, does welfare sit somewhere different on our priority list of concerns? So I don't have a clear answer for that, but just throw that out there for others' thoughts.
On that, because you touched on our prioritization as well, there was another question going to that. I think in your talk, in one of the scenarios that you were presenting, you had a conclusion that in some cases you would prioritize biodiversity over welfare, where they traded off significantly. And the person asking, Mel Graham, is asking whether that's due to inherently valuing biodiversity or valuing it instrumentally or for some other outcome.
Well, I don't think there's a general answer to that. I mean, some of us may, I think I value it inherently, but there can also be in some cases instrumental value. So that's also part of the discourse. But I mean, obviously, we've been talking about cases where you can have enormous problems with. I mean, there was a tortoise case that you talked about, Stefano and Elisa. I mean, that sort of animal seems to be really, really a problem if you want to preserve some of the original tortoises in a certain area. So there are situations where it's very clearly that if you want to uphold what we call natural biodiversity, you need to do things. And there we chose to say, okay, in that case, we probably pro-conservation and say, well, in that case, animal welfare must be given second priority. And other situations are different. I don't know, Lisa, I mean, you had the case. I mean, what's your own view? Where do you draw the line?
I think it's sometimes hard to say because, for example, in our project, the Trachemis project, it's sometimes also very political because there are laws that sort of try to protect the animal welfare and they then restrict actions. So I think it's sometimes very much connected that you sort of have to consider animal welfare to then be able to protect nature and to do something for biodiversity, because you sort of have to convince also politicians and whoever is actually doing the work, like management practitioners, to do it because they all consider welfare being important.
I'm gonna move. I have a very specific maybe question for Alan, but maybe everyone else will have comments on this as well. There's a question about whether there is an issue when applying contraceptive to wildlife, whether you might be selecting particular types of individuals or particular behavioral types over others. And yeah, what are your thoughts or comments on this?
This issue has been raised. First, in the context of whether.
Can't hear you, Ellen.
Can you hear me?
No.
You're just a bit quiet, Alan. So you're in the background.
Can you hear me at all?
Yeah, I think better when you're closer to the.
Okay, I'll have to be close here. The issue of impacts of contraception has been raised in the context of potential selective effects on immune systems. It hasn't been shown, but it's certainly something that could happen if it was being used on a really wide scale. We've never used it on a really wide scale, and probably any sort of genetic effects would be swamped by other populations, but it's something to watch. As far as behavioral types, we do, we're treating animals that are easy to find. And certainly in the short run, if there are issues of boldness or shyness in animals, there might be some selection there for more recalcitrant animals, the ones that hide in the woods. But that's sort of the next order of research out there. We haven't gotten that far yet.
Can I ask Alan a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So Alan, I'm kind of curious. You said in your talk that using the contraception didn't seem to affect the social structure in deer populations. And I was just kind of curious. I mean, if you haven't got offspring, it seems inevitable that it's going to affect the social structure. So I'm just curious as to what you say about that.
Well, first point is that there seems to be some sense that culling does not affect social organization. And of course it does tremendously, especially in sort of matrilineal social species like deer, where if there's intense hunting pressure, females don't get past like 2 years of age, and so they never form any sort of matrilineal relationships. I think maybe over time it would, but never over the sort of 5 to 10 year time frame that we've looked at. There are always some fawns, there are always some foals, and the bonds among individuals are pretty strong. Among adults, are pretty strong, as well as the tendency to remain in the same areas, the same home ranges. Again, over lengthy periods of time, maybe you would start to see something, but we haven't been doing it long enough to see it.
Now that you've mentioned personalities, I'm going to jump with a question that links to the wildcats and being out there, and like the personality can affect dispersal. And there's a question about whether in the wildcat project, whether you are tracking other types of welfare issues that might not be directly caused by humans, such as inability to find prey or conflict with other local species, like competition with other species. You're on mute. No, you're muted. That's all right.
Okay, Alice, your mic is showing that it's on, but we're not hearing from you, so you might need to change set. You want to ask Grace a question while Alice?
So the question, well, I'm going to have to, sorry. I have one for Stefano and Lisa, and then one for Grace while Alice maybe can get her volume up. Oh yeah, Stefano, sorry, I lost my track of train of thought there. Lisa and Stefano, you were mentioning that you were saying that expert elicitation is always going to be sort of necessary, at least in the exercises that you're running to try and incorporate welfare in decision making. You also mentioned that there's lack of evidence in a lot of times in terms of hard data on how different interventions affect welfare. In how much are the experts agreeing or disagreeing in light of lack of evidence? What do you find?
I'm going to try, and then Lisa, you can jump in. But can you hear me? Yes. Yep. Yeah. Not a lot. It depends on many things. It depends a bit on the quality of evidence, but we in this type of exercise we've been tracking what we call the noise, like there could be disagreements, but just lots of uncertainty, lots of different opinions. Big, like it's massive noise in this type of elicitation, and not just limited to welfare, but other things like disease risks, and there is a lot of noise, and some of that will be some sort of linguistic ambiguity, so things that maybe people interpret different words in different ways, and we can try to clarify that, but a lot of noise persists. Sometimes it's clear disagreements, like it's clear differences in how people see systems working, or people see as a big threat or a dominant dynamic, but other times it's just uncertainty. People don't know, and so they have to make guesses, and these guesses are different. And when I say big, it's like 3 or 4 times the level of noise that would be considered big in business planning or something like that. So it's enormous. I'm not sure that we can ever reduce that. We just need to accept that it exists, and when we ask people to give us an opinion, there could be different opinions, and so we could be making the wrong decision, and we need to ask more people. I think that's the best we can do, is sort of guide ourselves that way, maybe try to represent different views of the world and be realistic. Is that satisfactory?
Yeah,
not really.
I can just agree, I think. Yeah,
thanks.
And this is, sorry, I want to say, this is with the same evidence. So people that have access to the exact same evidence give different opinions.
Yeah, that's interesting. Alice, I don't know if you've had any luck with the sound. No, sorry. That's okay. You get either type of response, or I can venture the answer, which I know is yes. You're looking at the welfare, other aspects of welfare in the Wildcat program. So maybe next time you can tell us about those as well. And I have a question for Grace, and we're coming up towards the end of the session and the day, so I'll just have a quick question about, maybe the answer will be long, is who or what mechanism can we encourage to introduce behavioral change more?
So yeah, it's quite.
Oh no, now we've lost your sound as well. Sorry, Grace, we cannot hear you. I don't know if you can hear us.
You were on, Grace, and then you went off. Do you want to try and turn your mic on and off again, see if that works? Showing us offline now, Grace, which is not ideal. Do you want to try speaking?
Well, we'll see if Grace can come back, but in the meantime, or maybe one last question for everyone. And Pete, I'm also going to ask you to join in. But the question, I think, for everyone is, where do we go from here? And is there any role or a sort of, I don't know, overarching sort of wildlife management ethics committee, or like, what are your thoughts on, yeah, where do we go from here? Anyone can take this.
I think my microphone works. There was a specific question for me also in the chat about whether we should just become postmodernists and give up the distinction between facts and values. And I have to say, I'm a staunch modernist. I greatly believe that we need a factual discourse and a value discourse. And I think combining those in intelligent ways is the way forward. because I think there's science that we need to hear as science. And then there's an ethical discourse where we should admit that we have different backgrounds and that no one has a sort of a right view, but rather different views that we need to find compromises. So I'm a great fan of a modernist project where ethics is admitted as one part of this equation, and we allow for much broader debates. And for example, the discussion we've had now about where exactly to situate welfare and conservation will be anyway negotiated. But if science is more active in being part of that negotiation and not just trying to deny the issue, that would be a great help, I think.
Anyone else?
Can I say something? So in practice that so basically what we try to do is what Peter's just described in terms in close to management. So to help people find the right science to reflect their values. But personally, one difficulty that we've encountered in the last year or so is that I don't find a lot of awareness of welfare science. You know, there's a wealth of geneticists, there's lots of demographers like myself, or just, you know, biologists or wildlife biologists. And so it's easy to express those objectives, expectations, even for managers and policymakers. And when welfare is mentioned, they don't know what that profile is. I was just surprised, you know, when you mentioned we should consider welfare as an additional objective, and they wouldn't know who to ask.
But I mean, because we gave the diagnosis of that, it's because so far welfare scientists have shunned away from talking about welfare, except for these rare cases where we intervene. So maybe welfare science should come into the game much more. So Pete, you should make your colleagues get off.
Well, I think you're right, actually. And I think, you know, sort of in trying to wrap some of these things up, I think one of the challenges is to improve education around wildlife welfare in general, and perhaps more specifically looking at the wildlife welfare impacts of many anthropogenic actions, as we've talked about today. But I think it was heartening today to hear that many of the presentations in one way or another address that aspect, even if we didn't all agree on the sort of ways to get there. But I think you know, meeting together has really achieved a lot. We've shared some visions about things, and I think doing this in an informed way does allow us to, I think, pick up a number of challenges, because there's been a huge amount of information today, tons of food for thought. And I mean, I think we've had a really fantastic day overall, bringing lots of different things together. So this is something that the Wild Animal Welfare Committee is going to be taking forwards, guided not least by a lot of the things we've heard today. But yeah, I do accept the challenge, Peter, and you know, it isn't something that I've been unaware of. Perhaps we've been a bit too shy in picking that up, but you know, we've even from 3 or 4 years ago, and I think that's something that we definitely need to do, and we have a responsibility to do as well, I think. So perhaps, Maria, right, it's the time for me to sort of end on a sort of consensual note, and you know, a really big thank you to all of you and the other speakers today for addressing such a wide range of topics. And you know, it's been great to have you all on board, and I should say to the delegates still online, and we'll let the others know that all of the talks are going to be available afterwards on, or most of them are available now on YouTube already, but all of them will be on the YouTube channel for you to look at. So that's been really useful. So thank you to the speakers, thank you to all the delegates, and also for posing those questions. We've been a bit pushed for time to deal with all of them, but for some of those questions which, you know, are very informative as well, we might well come back to some of those posing questions for some further discussion. And just finally, I'd like to thank all my WAWC colleagues, especially those who've been acting as chairs. I'd especially like to thank Steve Wickens at U4 for making everything flow mostly without a hitch. So Stephen, thank you very much indeed for making everything work. And you know, if you like what WAWC's doing, please follow us, and please have a look at our website. But that's me going to sign off the meeting for now. Thank you all to everyone. I hope you've had an informative and enjoyable day. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Bye for now.